jewel. It is an absolute jewel of Dereham, and the work that's gone into this, voluntary by so many people, to make it what it is today is absolutely brilliant. I know it's going to go on in the future. There's a lot more that is in the pipeline and ideas, and I think we should all be so pleased to have this in our town. And hopefully, with things going on, it will soon be more open to the public and visitors and everything else. So, and more signposts so everybody can see it. So, you know, thank you all for coming. I'm going to cut the ribbon now because it's about to rain. And, you know, welcome to Bishop Bonner's cottage.
They've got more sense than to run us over. They'll mess up their insurance for years to come.
Display about the history of the building in the middle of this room, and that end collections of what we would have found in people's houses about 100 years ago. So do have a look around. I haven't introduced you as our President, Jonathan Boston, and thank you for coming, Mr. President. Peter.
Well, simply to say to my father that we should owe real thanks, because when he came here as vicar in 1945, there were plans afoot to get this place knocked down so that they could widen the road. He wasn't a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries for nothing, however, and he had many friends, amongst which was Professor Albert Richardson, a great authority on this, and he rallied his forces to some effect. And far from being on a danger list, it became a jewel in the crown. And of course, it's the oldest domestic property in Dereham.
Yeah. So, well, thanks to your father.
Jack.
One-armed Jack.
One-armed Jack.
Yeah.
He'd been living rough, and he'd lost an arm in the First World War. He wasn't very taken with the idea of the artificial hand, which didn't do anything, but he was much more pleased with having a good hook on it, which does anyone remember Sergeant Bracey?
Yes, I remember.
Well, Jack used to live rough on Scarning Fen, which is just beyond Washbridge, of course. And that was all right until they wanted to lay a new sewer across. And they were digging up this trench, and Jack took the view that you might take if somebody's going to dig a trench across your back garden. Except, of course, it wasn't really his. So, to show his displeasure, he chopped the handles off all the tools. So when they came back on a Monday morning, there was a bit of a lull in the work. So somebody got a bit officious about this, and said Sergeant Bracey, who is a bit of a stickler for the law, not unnatural in a policeman, of course, but Jack resisted arrest, as they say, and it took about 5 men, I think, to lay Jack out before they could get him away. That wasn't the end of the story. Sergeant Bracey, I think, was probably a little more diplomatic in his dealings with country folk after that. And it went to court, and Jack had assaulted a policeman, so he sent to prison. A few days later, my father had a phone call. Padre, because his ex-military man, Major Tarr here. And Major Tarr was the governor of Norwich prison. And he said, look, I've got one of your chaps here. He's a jolly good bloke. He lost an arm in the war, you know. And he really oughtn't to be here. I don't see any reason to keep him. He's named you as his next of kin. Which, in a sense, was perfectly true, because Jack had a certain amount of money coming in from his pension and his wounds. So my father said, you must have a savings account. So he took him up and they opened it up. So Jack put father down, or possibly my father did, as an next of kin. So my father drove up to Norwich prison, so I've come to collect Jack Allison. He says, oh yeah, yes. And out came Jack and came back, and my father said, no, where are you going to stay? And we had a bullock lodge at the bottom of the garden. We'd offered him a room in the house, but he didn't want that. So he stayed down for a long time, and one way and the other, he ended up, this part became vacant. The main door was the one that you just opened. Luckily, you now have a key to it. Jack lost his, But luckily he had the key to that one as well, which was upstairs. But he couldn't get from, they were separate properties. So he made a hole in the floor, and then he used to sleep downstairs, getting on the hole in the floor. And what bedding and mattresses used to go to all the jumble sales in Church House. And whatever jumble was left over, Jack said, "I'll have that," and they gave it to him. And he had this great big sort of like a big doggy cushion that he slept on, and was happy here for a long time. Age and condition got the better of him in the end, and the odd drink or two didn't always help. In fact, one New Year's Eve, we found Jack sitting in the gutter outside, and we said that there are better places to be, so we opened the door and got him up. We couldn't get him upstairs. He was about 6'4". He was a big man. He would lift a sack, 100-weight sack of leaf mould and our wood with one arm and hoik it into the back of the trailer, just like that. So he was not a person to be lightly regarded. Anyway, we managed to get him so that I managed to get him leaning up the stairs, and we shut the door, thought that'll hold him there. Well, it didn't. Later on we came down, there was Jack lying right across the road, having half come round really, and bashed his head. So Nancy Clark, as she then was, Nancy Briggs as she later became, of course, she was a keen guider and everything else, and knew all about first aid. So we patched him up, and somehow got up. I think we got him through here, but my own recollection is a bit hazy on that. But anyway, he stayed here until latterly he went back to Beach House, where he had initially been. But when he went there initially after the war,
That's the workhouse.
it was a workhouse. I mean, it wasn't called that, but it was just like it had in the army, and it had enough of barrack room life and having your arm blown off. And he didn't want to risk the other one, did he? So but by then, of course, it had changed considerably, and he was actually glad to report he was very happy there, and he'd take his little walk down the road to the new inn at Beatley, which he knew, of course, because well, we have the wood opposite, just under 8 acres of it, and he used to come and help us on that. And if I went over and he wasn't there, I'd always leave him a pint behind the bar, you know. And then we think it was about 1975 that he died.
Did he die here?
No, he died in Gresham Hall.
In Gresham.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I came back to take the funeral, and Tony Aldis rang us. Those of you who knew Tony, and I'm sure many of you did.
The undertaker.
Yeah. Jonathan, it's Tony here. Is it? Jack's gone. Local clergy not very helpful. Yeah, very difficult. I said, well, we want you to take the funeral. Well, I will if they're willing. Yeah, that's all right. So
That's it.
then we went, yes. I think next time we met was probably at the Brisley Bell, but that's another story. Anyway, so, you know, I've got a long connection with this place.
Are there any photographs of one-armed Jack?
I can't
I've never seen
recall
one.
I've
any.
never seen one.
I've never seen one. I have a very clear picture in my mind of what it looked like. He was bald-headed, but you didn't see much of the bald head because he'd always got his old flat cap on.
Yeah.
And he never was without his stick. It wasn't really one he leant on. It wasn't always really with a cudgel about that long.
Yeah.
And I do know that my father prepared him for confirmation, and when the bishop came, Jack sat in the church, and with some difficulty he persuaded Jack to leave the stick in his pew when he went to be confirmed by the bishop. He might have misinterpreted the advance of somebody like that. I mean, he probably banged his head on the ceiling here many times. The little story to just finish with Jack, though, because he got ragged quite a lot by some of the youngsters who didn't understand him.
Yeah.
But my mother and I, we never had any difficulty with Jack. And if she had to nip out and do some shopping, and when we were both quite small, because I was away when I was 10 years old, we could be left with Jack in the same way that you might leave your children if you'd got a very large, rough-coated German Shepherd. We were in no danger whatever. And during that, Mrs. Stevens, I forgot what her first name was, she lived down at West End, used to come come and help with the cleaning. And she said, yes, I remember, Jack, when we were at school, this was before the First World War, she'd been pushed around or something, and Jack picked her up and carried her home when he must have been about 11. In fact, incredibly gentle person and very disciplined. If I was camping out in the garden, I'd wake up in the morning, there'd be Jack at the water about shaving. You know, he was the old soldier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That's great. Thank you. Good to see so many of you here. Enjoy yourselves. Lovely to have
And I
you.
think he also wore an army greatcoat.
There were two people who wore army greatcoats. Jack was one, and old Billy Burrell was the other. And Billy Burrell used to oscillate like Jack did between the cherry tree and one or two other places. Yeah. And in fact, I know Billy's nephew, who's well, the Burrells were a Beeston family. Just near Litchfield.
Yeah, there was a Burrell had the farm from Dereham on the way to Litchfield on the left.
That's
There was
it.
a Burrell because I was at school with one of them.
Yes, well, they're all the same. And I don't know if you knew the farms out in Chapel, Roger Kemp out at Milan.
Yeah,